hopefully you've had enough coffee and you're raring to go. We're in the meat of the day. So we hope you enjoy this wonderful panel discussion that we've got lined up for you. And please do take advantage of the opportunity to ask some questions as we come towards the end of it as well. So this is part of the British Diplomatic Network in the United States Digital Pride Series. Obviously, this is a very unusual year. Normally, we would expect over the summer to be marching in Pride celebrations around the country, which is something we've done for a number of years now. But in light of the fact that we can't do that, we wanted to make sure that we were creating opportunities to reach out to the community, to talk about what it is that we're doing, and to hear about some of the challenges and issues and successes that we're having in this space at the moment. This is, I think, probably the 5th or 6th of these that the network has done over the last 3 weeks or so. I know that our embassy is due to be finishing that up shortly, towards the end of this week, I believe. And I think it's just worth noting very quickly, for those of you who didn't know, that the UK is the first foreign government to have ever marched in pride parades across the US. We made it a particular point of our public diplomacy to make very clear what we stood for. We chose very deliberately to do that in places which often were more challenging environments for LGBTQ plus people. We didn't just do it in relatively friendlier places like LA. So we, for example, in the last couple of years that I've been here in this post, we've marched in LA, certainly, in Salt Lake City, in Long Beach, in Venice, in Palm Springs. And my colleagues across the rest of the US have done that similarly in cities across this great country. And this is not just something we do in the US, though. So the British Diplomatic Network around the world celebrates Pride every year, wherever they may be. It's particularly interesting, I think, though, to be having this conversation here at this point. Diversity is this region, or one of this region's greatest strengths, in my opinion, and that diversity is certainly reflected in the wonderful staff that we've got working at the Consulate. And as we have a very interesting subject for you today, talking about LGBTQ plus representation within the film and television and the entertainment industry, at a very tricky time economically for that sector. You'll all have probably been following in the media all the various plans and protocols have been put in place in the UK and the US and elsewhere to try and find ways to get people back to work. And it's critical as we do that, of course, that the opportunities to get back to work apply to everyone equally. So I think it'll be really interesting to hear from our panelists, about how they're grappling with these issues systemically, but in particular, what we can do in the context of that COVID recovery to make sure that we don't backslide and in fact we make progress. That's all I really wanted to say by way of introduction. Again, welcome to everyone and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to the gentleman who's going to be convening and moderating the panel. That is Jeff Brewer, who is one of our best and brightest. He's our head of press, politics and public affairs at the Consulate. Thanks very much. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. And thank you to our panelists and all of you who are tuning in to watch this conversation on this very important topic. I just want to jump right in and start with a quick question to each of our panelists, starting with Sarah Kate Ellis, who's CEO of Glaad. If you could just please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what LGBT plus representation on film and television means to you, and how does that fit into your role at the organization or your activism?
Hi, well, thank you for having me. And again, my name is Sarah Kate Ellis. I'm the president and CEO of Glaad, which is about a 35-year-old media advocacy organization for LGBTQ plus people. And so we were founded during the AIDS crisis in New York City to help or to hold journalists accountable to the way that they were reporting on the AIDS crisis, specifically gay men. And at the same time, during that, what we realized was that we needed to work in Hollywood and lobby the studios to represent us, to humanize our community, to tell our stories. So we looked at it in two ways. One was to hold journalists accountable. And number two was to make sure that we had representation in storytelling. And so it's in our DNA, representation and storytelling. It's critical to humanizing our community. At that time, only 10 or 20% of the US population said that they personally knew someone who was gay. Today, if you ask the US population, only 20% says they know someone who's transgender. So people are meeting gay people or transgender or LGBTQ plus people through storytelling, through Hollywood's version of who we are. And so it's our jobs to make sure that that is fair and accurate and that it's actually happening, that stories are being told.
Oh, thank you for that. That lays a nice little groundwork. How about you, Peppermint? You tell us a little bit about what LGBT plus representation on film and television means to you and how it fits into your activism.
It means everything. I have to, I guess, echo what Sarah said, and hello, everyone. Sorry for being late, I had to make an entrance. It's absolutely, LGBTQ plus representation in media is absolutely, it's crucial how it's handled. And we know that, as Sarah Kate said, most people say that they don't know or haven't met someone who is trans or gay folks or just many different people in the community. And so that representation absolutely does matter. It's more than just entertainment. And when we're talking about, I guess to the average consumer, media is, they talk about media as though it's just entertainment and that if the stakes aren't high. But in fact, this is how, especially during the pandemic, how most, I'll just say Americans, are consuming anything. They're getting it from their phones. They're getting it from their television screens. They're not going to the movies right now, but they're watching the movies on TV. So I would say most of the opinions, information that we get comes from some sort of media, whether it's social media or Hollywood or something, or a combination. And so we can't even downplay it as though, this medium is not a major factor in how people get their information, how they communicate with each other, how they identify, who they vote for politically. If it weren't if it weren't a factor, then there wouldn't be things like propaganda films, and then also, folks interfering with social media, people using social media on grassroots. And so this is all really crucial how we're represented. And in a day and age where the transgender murder rate is so high, where hate crimes are on the rise, people engaging with a well thought out, well represented queer person is doubly as crucial. And then we also have to think that we have to acknowledge, I think, that this entertainment, this media is also a business. It's how people are making their money. It's how companies are making their money off of talent, and it's an economy. And it's important to bring trans and gender nonconforming people, LGBTQI people into that economy so that they have more empowerment as just citizens. And so I think it's a huge complicated topic, but it's definitely something that's really important and it's effective. If I had seen someone who looked like me, who I resonated with at a younger age, then my life may have turned out one way or another. And I still remember, even though I never had seen a Black trans woman on television as a child, I definitely remember people that I sort of identified as queer and people that I connected with. And I was like fans of theirs, even if they didn't say, even if I didn't really know, how they identified or who they, really who they were.
Thank you. That's good. It's really nice to hear all of that, and it sets up a couple of the questions I have later on, so we can come back to some of those points. Tim from BAFTA, I'd love to turn to you now to hear a bit about how you feel about those same questions.
Sure. So yeah, I'm Tim Hunter. I am the Director of Learning and New Talent at BAFTA. And so BAFTA's best known for the awards that we do in film, TV, and video games. But the area of BAFTA that I work on is the Learning a New Talent program, which is a year-round program of events and also talent initiatives. And by that, what we mean is we work with our network of members and industry contacts to identify people with talent at all stages of their career. And then BAFTA opens up our kind of network to those people to help to ensure that they're achieving their potential. And we have different schemes at different levels for different ages. So right up to kind of a scheme called Elevate, which is working with people who've got quite established careers, but are finding that they're hitting a glass ceiling. So at the moment, we're working with actors who feel like they're being typecast or always being cast as kind of the best friend but never the lead. So those are all people who are from underrepresented groups. And diversity and inclusion, I'm not going to say that BAFTA is doing an excellent job here at all, but it's a massively important to BAFTA. We were the first major awards organisation to introduce diversity criteria in the awards. And at the moment, we're just going through a major review of all of our processes to uncover some of the systemic biases. But going back to LGBT plus representation, I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about some of the initiatives that we run later. But we did a video recently for Pride Month where we asked LGBT plus nominees from recent years and also people who are part of our talent initiatives to talk about a moment that they remember where they first saw themselves on screen. And I think this picks up on what Peppermint was saying, that is part of BAFTA's mission statement to champion the transformative power of film, TV, and games. And I think that if you're part of a minority, that moment when you saw somebody that you relate to on screen, like you just know the power of that. For me, it was Ricky from My So-Called Life, if that means anything to anyone. Well, yeah, loud print shirts and the like. So yeah, I think like anyone who's been through that experience knows the power that it can have and how it can really help you to feel seen and legitimate, really.
Well, thank you, Tim. I'd like to dive into a little bit deeper questioning now, and starting with Sarah Kate at Glaad. Can you tell us a bit about deeper about the role that Glaad plays in ensuring LGBT stories are told, and some of the ways that you go about doing that? Because really you've blazed this trail, and a lot of the gains and results we see today are from your organization. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure. I think our founders were brilliant, by the way, and what they realized initially was that not only did we have to hold people accountable, but and call them out, be a watchdog, if you will, but they also realized that the way you get more bees with honey or whatever that is. I usually mess those up, but it was creating our own awards that recognized creators of content who did a fair and accurate representation. And that has really balanced our work in terms of holding people accountable, but also rewarding fair and accurate representation. We do annual reports. I always say you can't move what you don't measure. And so we measure television and streaming content. We measure video games. We measure film and studio. And what we are able to do then is understand what is lacking. So one of the things, and we've been measuring, we've had a TV report, TV/streaming content report for a quarter of a century now, for at least 25 years. And what we've seen there is that more and more representation has happened in TV and streaming. Streaming really was the driver of that, right? Because their business model, as Peppermint was saying, this is a business, their business model was different. And so they weren't measuring success the same way that network televisions were. They had more freedom. And I think they pushed the envelope more, which then pushed networks more as well, and gave them a certain freedom. For the first time, so we measure LGBTQ plus representation. We measure people with disabilities, we measure people of color, we measure people of color who are queer representation, measure a whole host of representation, not just LGBTQ and not just white LGBTQ. And what we've pushed for over the past few years is more people of color representation. For the first time last year on television and network, we found more people of color content, LGBTQ content than ever before. Now, there are a few shows that push that over the edge, Pose being one of them. But it was really exciting to see that, like, as I was saying, if you measure it and you focus people on that, you can actually move representation that way. Our television, our film representation right now, we're probably going to be adjusting that report in the future, because we've only looked at the big 7 studios, wide distribution. And just, you know, from a BAFTA perspective, America, or the US's #1 cultural export is film, right? Is content, is what we put out there. And so that's why these wide releases are so important, because these wide releases go far beyond our borders to influence culture and perception. So sadly to report, in film, there has been zero, last year, in our last year representation, there was 0 trans representation. And we're seeing the gay, lesbian, bi representation start to pick up. It lags 25 years behind TV. And it's non-existent for the trans community. So we're hoping that, we're not hoping, we're working with studios. Hope is not a strategy, actually. We are working with a lot of studios right now to incorporate more trans storytelling, more LGBTQ storytelling. The more boutique studios are doing a better job at it, for sure. And they have more room for that, but they're not wide distribution. And that's a really important factor here, is the distribution of the films.
Thank you. And we're going to come back, I think, to that point specifically in a little bit, when after BAFTA's questioning on how we can nudge forward some of these larger studios. So I'm glad you brought that up. A second question then, especially on the distribution point, how does this type of sort of intentional representation that you work towards targeting help advance the actual cause of LGBT rights, like to translating the representation into actual real gains and rights? And does it work around the world the same way as it does in the US?
You are talking about hearts and minds. So absolutely. This is an emotional connection. This is humanizing a community, and not demonizing a community. And so what's so critical for us as the LGBTQ plus community is that people understand who we are and understand our stories. Now, if you look at, there's a new film out or documentary, I should say, on Netflix called Disclosure, which documents trans representation in film and TV over the past several decades, similar to the founder of Glaad, who did the Celluloid Closet, which was gay representation, right? And so you can see that, you know, I always, it's the easiest thing to lean back on, but when when Vice President Biden says that Will and Grace did more for marriage equality than anything else, it's because it got the country behind it. It got people, it humanized who we were. It's kind of, and that's what storytelling does, right? That's how storytelling works. It makes what you might not know as a person, it brings it into your living room, it brings it onto your phone, it creates a connection and it humanizes. I always say, we soften the ground so that policy can move forward. We create the emotional connection so that people understand why marriage equality is important, why employment is important, why trans women, Black trans women are important and shouldn't be murdered on the street. And until we humanize and we bring context to our community's lives, then we will always be demonized and targeted. And so, and policy, you know, it's illegal to murder someone, but if you don't understand that that this is a valuable person, if this person's life does not have value to you and is not seen as valuable in this society, then that's on us. We need to move that forward, and that's in storytelling.
That's a really strong point and evocative of the situation we are sort of in right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good transition to a question I have for you, Peppermint. Just to lay a bit of the more groundwork, LGBT people of color have been trailblazers for equality, facing discrimination on the color of their skin, but also their sexual orientation or their preferred gender. On at least those two fronts, Black trans women in particular have been in the forefront, from the riots at Stonewall to now leading some of the largest marches during the Black Lives Matters, the Black Trans Lives Matters marches in particular. Yet Black trans women and trans women of color still face extraordinary violence, which was a bit mentioned by Sarah Kate. And the Organization of American States estimates that across the Americas, trans women have a life expectancy of just 30 to 35 years. In 2020 alone, 19 Black, Indigenous, and trans women of color have been murdered for being trans, just 4 in June, Pride Month alone. I want to mention one name. She was murdered in 1988, but it's Venus Xtravaganza. She was murdered during the filming of the landmark 1990 documentary Paris is Burning about drag culture in New York. For those that aren't familiar, this documentary, you probably have heard of Pose. Sarah Kate mentioned this, which is on FX, and Peppermint, you guest star in the 3rd episode of season 2. So everyone go check that out. I think it's now on Netflix. But Pose is sort of a fictional retelling of the legendary 80s drag scene, and it's largely influenced by Paris is Burning. In fact, a member of the House of Xtravaganza is in the film for the full 1st season as a judge. It's highly recommended. But now, my question for you, Peppermint, is can you reflect on what it means to see stories like those of Venus Xtravaganza? You sort of mentioned this earlier when you hadn't seen growing up a trans person before on TV, but to feel that now, to be part of it now, on a major television network in 2020, how can, so reflect on that, but also how can stories like this help better the experience of LGBT plus people, and in particular Black and Latinx trans people?
I think it's exactly, again, what Sarah Kate was talking about. I mean, in terms of Black trans women being at the forefront of a lot of the change and historic moments, I think it speaks to 2 things. Number one, I think there's, I don't know the adage, but it's, you know, those who have the least to lose often have the most to fight for. And so it's not necessarily shocking that someone who, as Sarah Kate had mentioned, socially has been undervalued or devalued as a human or dehumanized in film, television, and then therefore in society, it's not necessarily a surprise or shocking that those people would, when they see their opportunity, really go for it. I'm talking about performers, content creators, and all across the board. It also, I think, obviously speaks to the lack of opportunities historically that there have been. And so it's so iconic and historic that Laverne Cox has had a role in the show, because we've never seen anybody do a role in the show like this before. And so, you know, it's a 2-sided thing. But the impact on me, I think I can speak for myself, had I seen a Black trans woman on a major television show or movie when I was growing up, would have been, again, twofold. It would have shown me a sort of possibility for a life that was different than what I'd seen on Jerry Springer. Because to be honest with you, if I really think the only self-identified Black trans women or trans women, for the most part, the most of them, that I saw were on Jerry Springer. And these were episodes where the trans woman would profess her love to, I don't claim that this is highbrow television, but she would profess her love to her lover and then get hit over the head with a chair. And that was the response when someone would disclose that they're transgender to someone. A violent act is what happens. And then the audience cheers and hollers. And it would happen every single day or week whenever that show would come on. And that's all I saw. And it actually had an effect on me where I said, oh, even if I had everything else in line, this is not the life for me, because I don't want to get hit upside the head with a chair or worse. And so, you know, that representation again matters. And the impact of having seen a transgender, like the roles that I played a transgender doctor, pastor on God Friended Me. Had I seen a transgender pastor on a TV show before, would have shown me that there's more possibilities, and that not only for in the storytelling would that have given me a different vision of who I could be, of how I could be, how I could relate to other people. It would also give other people a vision of how they could react and relate to someone like me. Instead of picking up a chair and hitting us violently, this time they're your pastor. They're the person in a position of power. And so we can actually see demonstrated different ways to relate to trans people. And on top of all that, there's more. It would show us a human who is working in Hollywood as a successful, sought after person who's good at what they do in their trade or craft and gets rewarded for it. And like other Hollywood celebrities and actors and stars and content creators. And so it would have shown me that in my everyday life, not like in the movies, that there was a path for me, because I've always loved performing. And for the longest time, even in acting college, I was told that my Black queerness didn't fit with the business. I was paying to go to college to learn how to do this business, and was told you'll never work in Broadway, film, or television because of who you are. And if that message was heard loud and clear, so I veered off and went into the drag world and was embraced. But had I seen a trans woman, a Black trans woman on film or television, then I could have pointed to that and say, they probably wouldn't even have said it. And so the impact would be great, I think.
Are you hopeful that the emergence of Black LGBT people and other LGBT people of color, that their emergence in the mainstream of the last, let's say, decade, is, you know, since really Orange is the New Black, that will be sustained, and that it will have as great an impact on the lives of the people they reflect as we've seen, you know, in previous decades for other LGBT people?
I know that there's always cycles and trends, but I definitely think that we've made some headway that's irreversible, especially in the past couple of months. I think even those who were making an effort to cast LGBT people, Black trans folks, Black queer folks, making an effort to write those people into their stories. I think that even some of those people are probably re-examining their efforts in the past, and also going to take a longer look and a deeper look at better ways to be more inclusive in their creation and their productions. And I do think that it will be lasting. I sort of hope so. It'll at least be immortalized in film and television, you know.
Yeah, thank you. And some of that, I think, pivots to what I wanted to ask of Tim at BAFTA. Some of the things that we looked at, there was Moonlight, Orange is the New Black, Pose, Tangerine, RuPaul's Drag Race, A Fantastic Woman. Those have all been some breakthroughs. A few of those have even earned awards from Oscars, Emmys, and BAFTAs. How can major awards drive films and TVs into the mainstream? And how do we ensure that those awards, as well as other programs, ensure that these LGBT stories continue? Are there intentional steps we can take to make sure that these are reflected on screen?
Yeah, so what we introduced, I mentioned earlier, we introduced diversity criteria into our awards in 2018. And so in order to qualify for the British categories in the film awards, you have to demonstrate that you're working proactively to increase inclusion across 4 different categories. So on screen, behind the camera, training, and then distribution. So that's one of the levers that we have and that we've been using, and that's going to come into effect across all of our awards, across TV and games very, very soon. But at the moment, after our last nominations were announced, we announced a root and branch review of our process, because I think we can no longer say as an organisation that the films are not there, that that there aren't BAME or LGBT plus filmmakers that are there and that are kind of deserve to be highlighted. So we're at the moment, we're sort of in the middle of that review, and we're planning to make some announcements in September about how we're going to change our awards process to ensure that it's more of a level playing field. I think one of the big findings from my point of view is, well, it's been underlined through this process, is that kind of the notion of what is awards worthy is not a neutral construct. We come to it through a whole kind of range of different inputs from the media and from the industry, and some of the research that our partners at the BFI, the British Film Industry, have conducted has shown things like that for Black actors, they're much more likely to be cast within genre films, so within comedy and with horror. But if you think about how many comedy films and how many horror films ever make it through to the BAFTA Awards or to the Oscar Awards, so you can see how this kind of systemic racism then translates through and just gets amplified through the whole process. So at the moment, we're doing a lot of kind of introspection and kind of looking at external research to try and address those issues and ensure that it's not just the films with the biggest budgets that are coming through. Having said all of that, we have done quite a lot of work over the past 10 years to support people who are from underrepresented groups, and we are constantly looking at the data, constantly looking at kind of which groups aren't well represented. And one of the schemes that we run is in partnership again with the BFI, a key partner for us, and the Flair Festival, which is the biggest LGBT plus festival in the UK. And we work to identify up to 10 filmmakers every year who then get mentoring from people who are a few stages ahead of them in their career. And we've had some amazing people involved in that. Don't ask me to name any of them because I won't remember. But one of the big things, particularly for LGBT plus filmmakers, is that they're often in a bubble. I don't know if this sort of chimes with anyone's experience, but kind of they'll be in a festival circuit often getting high praise and big audiences at LGBT plus festivals all over the world, but they don't break out of that. And so that's kind of one of the key aims of this mentoring program, is to sort of say, what is it about the filmmaking, what is it about the way that it's packaged that kind of that just lends itself to getting sort of into a kind of a cycle of just going round in festivals and not breaking through into the mainstream. But like I say, it's not just, we don't want, and this is a key moment for us, we're not saying that these filmmakers need to change or that it's all on their shoulders. Also, BAFTA also needs to change the processes to ensure that those we're giving a platform to these amazingly talented people who are from all walks of life.
Thank you. And Glaad, I know that you have an awards that you talked about, so we, after this sort of next question, we can circle back around to that as well if you have anything else to add. But and this question as well probably applies to you as well, but for BAFTA, are there other examples of ways that the film industry, which Sarah Kate mentioned is 25 years behind television, that we can nudge along the industry to ensure more diverse stories are told beyond just what you had mentioned about major awards, things like that?
Beyond, I think it comes down to the people who are funding films and kind of commissioning TV. And there was a period not so long ago where there were more commissioners in television in the UK who were called John than there were people of colour. It wasn't John, but you know what I mean. That's the example. There were more Johns in the commissioning world than there were people of colour, and that I think does speak volumes. I think that there are people who are making these decisions about what gets greenlit. That often they are from the same kind of backgrounds. And one of the things, we did a piece of research a few years ago about where we spoke to people who have kind of achieved success but are from underrepresented groups, and we asked them what they attributed their success to. And equally what they felt held them back. And one of the things that they talked about a lot was this notion of risk, and how kind of risk is used to as a sort of proxy to hold people back often, and not intentionally. I made that sound was nefarious. It's not necessarily an intentional thing, and you can kind of understand where people are coming from when they're dealing with such big budgets. That kind of, but this idea that you're a risk, that just then affects all of the choices around. They might take a chance on a director, but that director is not necessarily then able to take the crew that they've worked with for years through to then the bigger budget film. And I think that's kind of one of the big issues that we really need to break down. And again, that's kind of, I think BAFTA and awards organisations have a big role in that, because who we award, that lessens the risk, because they are kind of sanctioned and endorsed, and so yeah. I think there's things on that level.
It's a great point, and it's been brought up a couple times, but we haven't really touched on it. But this is a business, and these films need, not all films need to be profitable, but to continue them, most of them do. Same with television. And I know that we are that was the end of our scripted questions that we were going to talk to. So this will be hopefully more loose, and I would love for you all to input as you feel needed. But have any of you seen evidence that more inclusive stories are more profitable and that they are more successful? Because it certainly seems that there is evidence out there, but this isn't my area of focus. So I'd ask if you have any examples of that, or what the trends speak to.
I could speak about generations. When you look at millennials, 20% of them identify as LGBTQ+. When you look at Gen Zers, about 40% on various different studies, this is in the United States, identify as LGBTQ+. So if you're looking for an audience, you need to, we're at in commercialism, you're always looking to attract the younger audience. If you get them first, then you have them for life type of theory. And I think that in order to attract them, you need to represent them, and they're going to hold you to that. They don't, this old formula, the old formula based in safety was also deeply rooted in misnomers, that Will Smith was the only Black person that, we've all heard this one out of Hollywood, straight from Hollywood executives' mouths. It was the only person that could travel internationally, the only Black person that can travel internationally. It is like, and there was a study actually done, like a top secret study years and years ago. I don't think I'm telling any secrets here. It's kind of almost laughable in Hollywood at this point, where they tested that, and it came back not true at all. The other thing is that these big budget films take 2 years, right, from green light to get into, from being greenlit to getting into the studio. They're $1 million budgets, these big budgets, and that LGBTQ specifically can get barred from certain countries, right? Where it's illegal, because it's still illegal to be LGBTQ in, I think it's about 70 countries at this point, nearly 70. And so, but that, I mean, you saw that with Disney. At one moment, Russia said that it was going to bar it. Disney didn't back down, and then it showed. So I think it's more of a misnomer, and it's sort of, we believe our own little urban legend that exists in Hollywood versus creating for the new, the now, the next. We're living in a model. They find one model that works year over year, and they just keep trying the same model. But that's the thing is that things are changing. Things are changing rapidly, and storytelling, really good storytelling, always wins. Always wins. And so I think that and I see executives more and more pushing themselves. I really do, out of their comfort zones and trying new things. And I think that they're more than ever ready to do that and are doing it. So I want to keep encouraging them to do that. But I think we've built these own little stories in our that go back years and years and have no weight to them.
Thank you. Anyone else? Peppermint, I know that you were one of the very first stars on Broadway in a leading role as a trans person at all, but a Black trans woman as well. That was highly regarded and I think financially successful play based on an English poet, I might throw out there. But have you found that you know your audience resonates, or you've been a part of some of these shows that prove this successful model? Do you have any thoughts on what that brings to the marketplace?
I've never been in any of the rooms where anyone is actually reviewing any numbers, but I can tell you, having been a part of, Broadway is one thing because it's not necessarily accessible to everyone, and you have to travel to New York to see it. There's a lot of different barriers to people being able to experience Broadway the way that we would want them to. And I think that all of Broadway would, my little aside here is that all of Broadway would benefit by following in Lin-Manuel's Miranda's footsteps and taping their show and airing it instead of telling everyone they can't have cameras and then there's no proof that the show existed unless you remember it. It's like a mirage. But I do, having been a part of RuPaul's Drag Race, I can tell you that just having watched a show like Drag Race before I was on it when it first came on TV, seeing it be sort of the little show that could, where there was a lot of, I know that folks were not in Hollywood. I'm sorry, my doorbell's being rung. Folks were not really taking it seriously by any stretch because it was drag, because it was queer. And so I think there was a lot of people that kind of would brush off Drag Race just in general, and a lot of opportunities were not necessarily open. Doors were not open. I'm so sorry. And so let me just get it. I'll be right back. Someone else offers. I'm so sorry.
So we are coming in sort of the last 10 minutes here. So I have one question I want to wrap with about the role that governments can play. But before we get to that, there's a couple points, and I'll let you guys pick from those you think that are most interesting. But one is about sort of the new fractured media space and whether that makes it more challenging to reach the audiences you need to change hearts and minds versus allowing more stories to be told and seeing what can break through. Another question that we had come through is the way, and this maybe for Peppermint could be to talk about, but the way that trans youth is represented on screen, especially as we see more and more people who see themselves reflected on screen having the courage to come out earlier. And I think that's probably enough those two questions to wrap us up before I bring in the last question. And Peppermint, the first question was the challenge of a more fractured media space, but also does that offer an opportunity for more stories to be told? And this is open for anyone to respond.
The challenge of a fractured media space. Yeah, well, just going back really quickly. So Drag Race is highly successful now. Now we see other networks trying to copy the model. We see Drag Race has opened up an entire economy. Not only is it a TV show, but now it has its own drag con, which is like Comic-Con, which is highly successful. There's one in LA, one in New York, now one in London. It's growing like a rash. And now it's franchised. It's not only Drag Race, it's All Stars, it's Drag Race UK, it's Drag Race Canada, Drag Race Thailand. It is a success. And I think that it's primarily, I mean, I'm sure they have great marketing and everything, but it's really because of these queer and diverse stories. They can do a lot better. We can all do better, but it is because of those queer and diverse stories that are being told, and these queens that are on your TV screen. And so it spawned other shows like Dragula, and now there's Drag Me Down the Aisle and HBO's We're Here. These are all starring Drag Race people that they've seen. So there's no denying that that a show like Drag Race that was heavily centered around minorities and marginalized communities and sort of the drag underground is wildly successful. And it is the antithesis of what, when we were talking about risk, it is the antithesis, I'm sure, of what anyone in any office who had any decision making, any gatekeeper would have ever dreamed would have been successful. And now they're all asking us to retweet their products. And so it does show that if you allow this space for people to be authentically themselves, then folks, like as Sarah Kate said, the younger generation will resonate with that. And yeah, I think I understand what you mean by saying the fractured spaces that people are able to consume their shows.
That is a show that was launched on Logo. One of
it's not on NBC.
Broken through. And internet has changed that. The streaming options has changed that. So I think that's an excellent point, actually, of a riskier story being told, perhaps, but in a smaller place. But it's able to break through and impact the lives of many people. And now you see, famous straight white male actors who
celebrity
say they become involved in drag. Then they say it helps open up their sort of lives in a way you would never have thought that would have happened. Any other thoughts on that topic, or the reflection of trans youth on screen as well?
I mean, yeah, I think you are seeing obviously a huge blurring of the boundaries. I mean, I do think people will always want to watch films when we're allowed to watch films in a cinema with other people. There's nothing really that compares to that experience of watching something on that scale with an audience. But all of those boundaries between film and TV and between online and TV, like all of that's blurring, and they're becoming kind of a lot more crossover between all of those different kind of media. And you can see lots of examples of people going from a YouTube series to a TV series, and from TV to film, and from film back again. So I think if you look at that whole economy as a whole, like it's probably a lot more encouraging than if you were to just look at the kind of films that break through and get recognition. Films are a huge investment. There's a great kind of juggernaut behind them in order to make them a success. And so that if you're just looking at films, you're kind of probably not getting the full picture. But I would also say there are probably, if you go back even 20 years, was a huge diversity of stories being told. There was the Flair, the LGBT plus festival that the BFI runs, has been running for something like 30 or 40 years, and that's always been pulling in audiences. It's always had packed out screenings. I think the films have been there, they just don't break through into that kind of public recognition.
I also think it's decentralized the power structure, which is critical to allowing people to now create. Everybody's a content creator, essentially, right? So if you're not seeing what you want to see, you actually can create it, which puts more pressure on where the power has been held, where the main distribution is, because now they're seeing, like Drag Race, is a great example of how it wouldn't get picked up by a major network. So we had Logo with, thank God, a lifeline like that. And there's Logo that is, in Drag Race, the little engine that could, and then once it hits that mainstream, it becomes, because then it's seen as a revenue driver, right? But I think that the decentralizing the power and more people having power about storytelling and creativity has put more pressure on sort of these power centers, and that's a good thing. And that is also why we're seeing an expansion of content and a need for these organizations. I mean, you look at any major Fortune 500 company, and the highest producers, all the what they call white sheets, one-sheeters on these companies, show that when you have diversity in your employee base, on your board, in your leadership, they're better performers. The same is true with content, because you're reaching more people. And we just did a study with Procter & Gamble, which is the largest advertiser in the world, right? To find out if having LGBTQ people in ads was seen as a good thing or a bad thing by non-LGBTQ people in America, in the United States. And overwhelmingly, non-LGBTQ plus people said that they liked seeing LGBTQ people in the ads, because one, it built their acceptance, their understanding, their education of LGBTQ people. And number two, they thought more highly of the brand that included them. They thought they treated their employees with more respect and their consumers with more respect. And so they buy from them more. So if you need a business story, there are a lot of business stories out there to help you push that forward. But what I will say to anybody who is a content creator, just because you're gay, just because you have a friend who's trans, does not mean that you can tell the gay or trans story. Please surround yourself with LGBTQ people from the community. Call Glaad, that's our job, that's what we do, representation. We think of it holistically, not just through one lens, because you are representing a community. And like Peppermint said before, that is a privilege, and that's an important privilege to take very, very seriously. It's not just entertainment.
Yeah, that's a really powerful message. And one of the questions I wanted to get to, if we had more time, was a question about who should be playing these stories and who should be writing these stories in particular.
Let's talk about it.
I think we started a little late, so maybe we can go one more question before I wrap up, if you're all okay with that. So I'll cede the floor to you all to talk about that.
I think that right now, when as we said, when television and film and media is so crucial and the stakes are so high, and we're telling the story and we're interested in, if you, again, as Sarah Kate said, watch Disclosure, clearly the world, consumers and also creators are interested in the stories of LGBTQ people. One of us is somewhere doing something in every movie. And so if that's real, then it's important to tell those stories authentically. If you want to be, why do we want to be dishonest about who these people are and misleading about who these people are? And the best way to do that is to include us. Nothing about us without us right now, because we know on the flip side of that, we are denying opportunities to people who are marginalized and disenfranchised, people who are having to make the choice of survival sex work, people who are being murdered in the streets. These people's, I can guarantee you, when I went to go and film on Pose, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, in my own opinion, but I highly believe it, that one day of filming has saved some sex worker from having to go and do their job. They were able to be on set in a safe space that was accepting and diverse, and they were making money in a way that would allow them to be creative. instead of the latter. And I'm not saying that sex work is bad, I'm not shaming it, but it was another option for them. And it was arguably potentially a safer option, given that the data that we know about how many sex workers are treated. And so it's really important and it's crucial. And if you can provide that, there's lots of Hollywood actors who would like to try on a wig and play and like learn something and be connected to this community. But it's more crucial than that. If this Hollywood actor is not risking their lives if their livelihood is not really at stake by not taking that role, let's see how we can diversify this a little bit, because it, honestly, at the end of the day, will be better for all of us.
That's really powerful. The power of opportunity is very strong.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's also, yeah, absolutely, we should be telling our own stories as much as possible. But I also think there's broader opportunities outside of like our own stories, which don't, if that was kind of, if parts were offered to trans women and trans men, or gay and lesbian men, actors and women across the board, in a more equitable fashion, then it wouldn't be as important that kind of every single trans character that's on screen should be played by a trans actor, because there are other opportunities. So it's not just I think we should guard against those kind of people being ghettoized into particular roles. It's across the piece, and I'm talking about in front of and behind the camera as well.
All right. Thank you all for joining. I have one sort of final wrap-up question, reflecting the sort of and acknowledging the power of a government like the British government, and having this opportunity to speak to a representative as well as the Consul General, who is Her Majesty's Consul General. If there was a sort of one thing or a thing that a government like the United Kingdom could do to help safeguard and advance LGBT representation and rights through this type of media engagement, what would you say, or do you have any sort of thoughts on that we can take back as a learning experience and potentially push forward in government?
I have a very, very specific thing, which I'm not lobbying for this because I'm not allowed to lobby for anything. But one of the things that some people have called for to look at is the cultural test that allows you to get a tax rebate. So, in order to attract film and TV making into the country, there's you get huge tax incentives, and there are currently no kind of or at least very few kind of restrictions around where that money goes and how you use it once you're so yeah, that could be something that could be looked at. But I'm not saying that. Other people have said that.
I agree. But I also think they need to prioritize trans lives, prioritize the talking about our trans brothers and sisters, raising awareness of, because they hold these powers, these positions of power, and they have a lot of access, and they can help build bridges and help humanize our trans community.
Anything? If that's it, then I just really want to thank you all for joining with us today, for making time to have this conversation. It's it was an adaptation we had to make because of COVID-19, but it is one I think that we will maybe move forward with. Maybe if not next year, it'll be in person, but I think allowing this extra space in addition to what we would normally do with the parade, I think is hopefully something that people value. And I would love to, to follow up with you all as we move forward and see how things change over time. So thank you so much for taking the time, for lending your voices. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you to all of our attendees. This will continue to live on. It was broadcast live on YouTube. It will be recorded and stored there. So if you want to share this to your friends or anyone else, or just reference back, feel free to do so. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.